Yes, welcome. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik16, founder and creator of Plates and Crates. And no, I'm not coming down on anything. I'd like to believe I'm gonna come up. Yeah, if you haven't put two and two together, this is a very special episode where we go to Texas once again, but this time we're not going to Houston. We're not physically in Texas. This time we're just taking a little mental journey to the city of Port Arthur, Texas, where we go to review this classic that we're talking about today, none other than UGK's Ridin Dirty. A little background, this is another 1996 classic that we didn't get to cover last year during our 1996 for the rest of the year campaign. So many dope albums from that year. If you're not familiar, take a minute and go back and review some of those albums that we covered for half of last year. And also while you're at it, go ahead and get familiar with the introductory videos that explain the whole ranking and rating system process. The I Used to Love Her scale is exhibited on whatever half of this shirt you can see right now, but you can see the whole thing if you go visit theraproller.com. That's where you can vote on each dimension in each category and put your own rankings there to contribute to the overall total. And you know, the more votes and things like that we get, it's prizes, there's other cool things, but more importantly, we're just building. And that's what this is all about. Thank you for everybody who's been on a journey thus far. While you're at it, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel so you get all the latest. Send me your requests. We're still riding high. Now we're about to ride dirty. This is category 1 where we go over the album, the product itself. Now a little background. This is technically the 3rd studio album from the group UGK, Underground Kings, consisting of Pimp C and Bun B. And this album had a very interesting rollout. So we'll get a little into that. Let's jump into the first dimension. First dimension when we go into category 1 is always going to be quality of production. Now, who's on production on this album? Well, you have in-house production from none other than Pimp C himself. Pimp C is behind the boards for the majority of this album, with some co-production credit by Sergio and Joe, who is a big deal and a big luminary in 90s Texas hip hop, responsible for a lot of Scarface and the Ghetto Boy sound. So it's, you know, only right that the other major group from Texas in the hip hop sphere in the 90s would borrow his talents. Now, what you get here is a use of so many different kinds of instrumentations and creative sampling on the part of Pimp C and Joe that you kind of have this feeling of a safe zone, but nothing about this album is safe, if that makes sense. So, for instance, let's take a song like Pinky Ring. We've heard a dozen of these pimp funk inspired songs with these simple patterns before, but it's so clean and head nod inducing that you just can't help but get into the groove of it. It borrows from this Curtis Mayfield funk guitar and it just keeps it real simple. It's just looped and it allows every other part of the song to do its thing, because it's just one of those nods that anybody who was raised on soul music can just get into. You don't have to know the original song it's sampled from, but it's a very it's just a very comforting funk groove, not too complicated and nothing about it that stutter steps. It's just fluid. And you can say the same about Murderer. You can say the same about Touched. You can say the same about the lead off song. So One Day You're Here, or One Day, it just comes on like every classic blues song that you've ever heard in your life, but not blues in like the down home sense, just blues, R&B blues, and then you hear that familiar Isley sound and you know that you're getting into something that's layered in soul, or dripping with soul, really. But it speeds up right after that intro. So the intro takes you to a familiar place. It feels like comfort, and then it speeds up organically, and where you know this is being hip-hopped out, and it's like, okay, we get the pacing and it just moves. So this is what we mean about safe, familiar, but still refreshing. It just grabs you in. So the music itself is compelling. The way it's sampled is so simple, but so clean. And so that's what you're getting with the production here. Pimp C is borrowing from all of the prevalent styles that we've already seen in hip hop, but encapsulating them all on one album concisely too. So the best of the best of the familiars. You got your pimp type track, you got your jazzy type track, and then on the darker tracks like Murder and That's Why I Carry, those tracks still had that familiar grittiness. Then you get some of the more specialized tracks, right? So let's talk about a song like Diamonds and Wood. Diamonds and Wood is introducing the screwed sound on a non-screwed up Click members album. So Bun B and Pimp C are almost like grandfathered in anomalies because they exist outside of the major clans and label entities that existed back then. In Texas hip hop, mid-90s, you have Rap-A-Lot Records, you have Suave House, and you have the Screwed Up Click. UGK isn't a part of any of those, but they cool and acknowledge and you know, give props to all three of those entities. And so for a non-Screwed Up Click member to use that screwed up sound as a chorus, that's, you know, paying homage, that's showing just widespread Texas love. But on a larger note, it's saying, hey, I'm gonna introduce this sound I'm gonna use the platform, the major label platform that I'm on, to introduce this sound. And so it's subtle because it's just the hook, but it's a precursor to how big that became kind of a prerequisite, and it blew up in the early 2000s or the mid 2000s as just kind of the go-to, no matter where rappers are from. New York rappers were doing it in their hooks. So I mean, for this to be 1996, that was a pretty that was a pretty milestone moment. And then, you know, I mentioned the production, the outside production from Sergio. So Sergio's production on 3 in the Morning deviates a little. And there's a few things that are done on this album that are not distinctly South. And I think very interesting choices were made, because if you hear 3 in the Morning, it sounds very much like what was going on in the East Coast, maybe 1 to 2 years prior to 1996. And it had that same kind of comfort and familiarity to the East Coast hip hop fans' ear. With the exception of maybe some of those Isaac Hayes inspired keys that come in during the hook, and then those periodic, what do we call these, kind of type of xylophone sounds that give it a Southern feel. It's weird that you would associate xylophones with Southern, but it's the way they're used. It's like these kind of hollowed out sounds that ring in the background that were, you know, commonly used in some Southern rap around this time. This could easily have been like a Digging in the Crates crew beat, or any underground East Coast New York rapper at the time. It almost felt like the Dr. Dre produced song for Sam Snead, honestly, and it had that kind of unexpected feel, just like the title track. You're not expecting, after going on this ride with Pimp C and Bun B, you're not expecting the album to end with a jazz sample, just like a smooth jazz sample that they made into this like contemplative gangster music. So where it gets super familiar is in the middle, where N.O. Joe takes the front seat, I think, and Pimp C takes the back seat. So on the songs Touched, F My Car, And that's why I carry. You're getting more of that standard Texas sound that is being used by like the Ghetto Boys. It's basically, hey, here's what I do for Ghetto Boys, I'm doing it for you. So you got your hard sound, you got your hard song, you got your funk song, and you got your kind of open bass song. So F My Car is just kind of open, little bass groove that allows Pimp C and Bun B to mostly let the lyrics speak for themselves. Touch is funk, funk guitar, regular, what you expect from Southern rap. And then that's why I carry is the hardcore version of Southern beats. Whenever there was like the dark, this is the album track where I'm really talking something more aggressive. You get those kind of sounds that you're getting there with those deep piano keys, and those organs and those chilling organs and chilling synths, but still with a funk bass. So that's the standard that's carrying throughout. Anyone familiar with Eno Joe production, he's gonna carry that funk bass in everything he does. As typical Texas sound as his production is on this album, there's notes like the voices in the background of That's Why I Carry. They give it a crisp kind of feel that can appeal to other markets. It still feels very, back then, that was mostly East Coast and West Coast that were using voices like that, haunting voices in the background of the beats. That's not something you really expect. And so every song has its familiarity, but with like a slight accent that lets you know this is UGK stuff. So it brought some real effort out of each of the producers that contributed to this album. So that's the range you're getting here. You got these unexpected elements, and then you got mostly familiar, borrowing from the best of the familiar elements. The other beat produced by Sergio, Good Stuff, is really reminiscent. It sounds like something that could have been on Snoop Dogg's debut album, Doggy Style. It just has that familiarity, head nod quality, and it's unexpected from the same person that gave you this super East Coast sounding beat earlier on the album to come back with this kind of G-Funk, comfortable, Southern but West feeling beat that samples the Fatback Band. They both work. And Pinky Ring sounds almost like an organized noise track that could have went on Goody Mob or Outkast album. And Murder sounds like it would have been on, Murder sounds regionless. Murder has this 808 drum, but the keyboard, the Moog keyboard sounds that Pimp C is using are coastless. It's for spitters. So this could have been from Midwest, West Coast, East Coast, or South. And I think what makes it stand out is that it's unexpected so early on the album for Southern rappers to come in with this up-tempo, non-funk kind of groove that just like makes you listen. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That's the quality of the production. Let's go into dimension 2 where we talk about the cohesiveness. So how does it all fit together, right? If we're talking about taking the best of familiar elements, there is the idea of sequencing. And I think Pimp C, what we learn about his production and his process going into albums, especially in these days, is that everything was intentional. And so you get these skits that lead most of the songs, except for maybe 2 or 3 of the songs. There's like these talking skits, and it vacillates. Basically, the idea is that there are 2 different types of OGs. One is obviously a black OG from the streets of Texas who's locked up, speaking from the perspective of being currently locked up in prison and speaking on the things that he's seeing in there and his condition. And from a braggadocio kind of angle too, not from a, hey, don't be like me, here's my regrets. More like, hey, this ain't nothing, but I don't get any peace in here. And then there's this, Hispanic OG who's talking about the state of things on the streets. And you can tell, they're speaking with broken English and, talking a lot about snitches and stuff. So as someone who's created an album that had talking skits, I know for a fact that it has to be an intentional choice, because Pimp C has it sequenced in such a way where these skits, these talking parts, are not skippable. They are at the beginning of each song. You have to listen to them if you want the song to play. I can imagine how that was if you had this album on tape. We'll talk about that in a minute. When I created the album that had talking parts, I made sure that I put those parts on the ends of the song. So if you didn't want to hear it or be bothered with it, or you already heard it, you can just skip to the next song, and the next song would start with music. But you have to believe, or at least take into account that Pimp C wanted you to hear what was being said by these OGs. Same could be said about the sequencing. A fine-tuned ear might notice that the first 5 to 6 songs not only have maybe some of the most compelling production that draws you in, but it's where Pimp C and Bun B are doing their most lyrical exercise. They're doing the most intentional acrobatics and things for real hip hop heads to tune into. So the first 5 to 6 songs, you're gonna get the biggest variety of flows, the types of hooks, and the types of beats. They're throwing their best at you. And there's even a part, we're speaking about tapes, at the end of the song, 3 in the morning, Pimp C adds this little musical break in there, which is something that, DJ Premier and Pete Rock would do often on their albums in the 90s, where it's just the intermission, just another sample break of a beat where, maybe some loose talking happens or it just vamps out. And so on this portion, this little break comes in and it's talking. It's like, hey, if you're listening to this on tape, it's time to flip it over. And I want to use that as a marker, because it's after that point that we go into the series of beats that were mostly produced by N.O. Joe, and the tone changes. When you get to those 3 songs, there's a slight shift. So it feels like the more mature portion of the album is the first half. If we were thinking of this in tape terms, then the side A has the mature, diverse effort portion of the album, and then the second half is the more reckless, raunchy, and kind of straightforward half. And then it picks back up by the time you get to the last 2 songs. By the time you get to Good Stuff and Ridin Dirty, you recapture some of that feeling from the beginning, where it's like, oh, variety and unexpected. But in the middle, this could have easily been mistaken for a Ghetto Boys album. They are, capturing some of that Willie D spirit of being just boisterous, brazen, and abrasive. And the beats, like I said, they're also that familiar Ghetto Boys sound. So it's standard Texas, and it's real in your face, and the subject matter gets a little bit more intense. So that's the only dip. There's like a little dip, and some people might consider that a hill, because that's what they came for. You came for that rah-rah music, but there's definitely a noticeable change for the fine-tuned ear. And if we're thinking of it in tape terms, that's the best way I could break it down, is for cohesiveness sake, is a more mature, diverse, and effort-based side, or a more hip-hoppy side, and then a more, standard Texas raunchy side. Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3. The question of, is there an intentional mood and tone that's being executed or presented here? If we factor in those 2 OGs leading the songs with their, observations of Texas life, right? Behind the wall and outside the wall, then that's a very soft undercurrent. You really would be, connecting dots if you're trying to use that or reference that as some kind of glue that sends the messaging for the album. Pimp C is actually more of the controller of the intent. Pimp C is more of the captain of the mood and tone than anything else, than any of the OGs talking, because Pimp C talks just as much. There's shout outs almost at the end of every song, and Pimp C shouts out everyone. And so it almost makes you wonder, since a lot of his verses tend to be more in your face and confrontational, it's like, who are these unfortunate souls who you have to beef with, or who's trying to test you? Because it seems like you show love to everyone. Almost everyone gets a shout out on this album, from Shaquille O'Neal to Master P. And I'm trying to remember the actor that got a shout out on there, but it'll come back to me. But it's just, like, Pimp C's personality, we'll talk about this in category 2, of course, is the nucleus. The whole outro is just him talking over a Bootsy Collins sample, laid back, talking on every topic and shouting out everyone he can, which continues what he's doing throughout the album anyway. And so if we're talking about a combined theme from a combined sentiment shared by both Bun B and Pimp C together, when they're on track, it seems that the mood and tone is, look, Texas can spit too. We repping Texas. As much as they shout out Port Arthur, they are really putting on for the state of Texas, and then on the second level, they're putting on for the South. It really feels like this particular wave of rappers, even though Andre 3000 might have said it in the year 95, it seemed like 96 gonna be that year. As Big Boy said, that the South really did have something to say, and the albums spoke for themselves. They weren't gonna go crazy. They were just gonna let the music speak for itself. So you gotta consider the Southern albums that were out this year. Prominent spitters were now making these waves throughout different regions, not just in their hometown. And other markets were forced to have to recognize it. Maybe not to the extent as what happened 2 years later, but definitely opened the door for someone like Master P to come and take over the following year. And then we know what happened from then. So, really, if we're thinking about 3 moods and tones here, right? You got the OGs talking, that's a Texas street tone. You have Pimp C's overall personality tone guiding the album. And then as rappers, you have the South got something to say tone. Pick one, pick them all, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 4. The repetition of words and sounds versus song distinction, or song distinction versus repetition of words and sounds. Because you're getting this variety of picking from the best elements of popular hip hop tropes, there's not a lot of repetition, because you're like, I want the best Familiar Soul sample, I want the best Pimp song, I want the best hardcore Texas song, I want the best hardcore East Coast sounding song, and I want the best jazzy song. You're getting all of this. It's almost like Pimp C went shopping from all of the people that laid the groundwork before, and was like, how do I make a classic? With only 13 songs, it makes it easier to do. They stay within that safe zone, that safe number of what works. So you're not counting the intro and the outro, and you have about 13 songs. And as far as words, some of the themes get repeated, but not a lot of the same words being used. When Pimp C describes cars, he goes into detail about certain parts and certain models and makes, and there he gets detailed when he wants to, and Bun B only repeats words when he's going into the more abrasive songs where he's just resorting to kind of dumbing down his vocabulary for cursing, and cursing overtly, which is why I say it almost feels like they step into the Willie D and Bushwick Bill box, but even by then Bushwick Bill had calmed down too. Yeah, not a lot of redundancy or repetition. The most repetitive elements on this album come from everyone outside of the actual members of UGK. So the N.O. Joe production has some redundant elements with the reliance on the funk bass and the funk guitar. And, the singing is just it starts sounding the same because it's not really singing, it's more chanting. It's more of a Texas traditional style that we've heard Devin the Dude make famous. 3 in the morning, same kind of thing. And also on That's Why I Carry, it gets out of hand. Those elements, if you're not listening close enough, it starts to feel like, that's the same kind of singing on the other song. But nothing straight from the delivery of Bun B or Pimp C. So something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5. The amount of content versus the amount of songs. And so I mentioned there's 12 songs on this album. That's if you're not counting the outro and the intro, and just 12 full songs. And you can break them down into 6 and 6 if you want. And from those 6, you get content because it's that safe number. And out of 6, at least half of the album is topical. Even a song like F My Car is staying on topic. And so really all a part of the whole angle of being these Southern representatives that are like, look, we come with stuff to say. Even on songs that seem to be loosely content-based, there's content slipped in there, but with the weightedness of what's being said. So these are songs about being in the street life, but with this sentiment of enjoying the spoils, but also recognizing the consequences and the ills that come with it. So it seems to be fairly balanced because out of 12 songs, at least half of those are going to be really topical, clearly topical, where they stay on. Even the aggressive in-your-face songs are like that. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 6, the features. You're not getting any major features here, and I want to take this moment to give a Denzel Washington, Will Smith soul clap to Ronnie Spencer, who is the first voice that you hear on this album. Mr. Ronnie Spencer, ironically named, doing his very best Ronald Isley impression and killing it to the point where many people, including myself, thought that this was Ron Isley for years. And it wouldn't be far-fetched because this was the beginning of Ron Isley adopting the Mr. Biggs persona. The Isley brothers were then signed to Island Records, Def Jam, and he had started doing collaborations with rappers. So it made sense to assume that someone doing the la 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 signature on an Isley Brothers sampled song would be Ron Isley and not Ronnie Spencer. But shout out to him because he got the job done. He understood the assignment and it just was the perfect pitch and set the mood and tone of the album off, which is a big deal to start your album with your deepest song. That song also features 3-2, who's throughout the album both rapping and singing. Again, it's a part of a Texas tradition where a lot of the rappers in Texas and artists in Texas were way before their time doing the rap sung style before it became a thing that got embraced by hip hop culture. It was just kind of part of the twang. You got Zero, you got Devin the Dude, and many others. It even was in Chameleonaire style. Bun B was in an interview and he was explaining that the song One Day was originally a 3-2 song, which is why 3-2 has the first verse on there, and 3-2 didn't really believe in it that much. And Pimp C, who's notorious for like believing in songs, even if someone else used it before, pushed for that, and it wound up being the first song. You know, 3-2 is stronger on this rap feature here because it's more straightforward, but 3-2 was not quite Devin. Rest in peace, but you know, there's on the hook for Touched, it's just like kind of these freestyle hooks. It doesn't have that same feeling, that it doesn't add this quality to the songs that, you know, having Nick Dogg on the hook does, where it takes it to another level. It's just kind of in there, and the singing parts, they're take it or leave it, they're hit or miss. If you like what 3-2 added to Touched, then cool, you got that. You also get a feature from C-Note from the Botany Boys, and that's on 3 in the Morning, and the hook on there is similar to the kind of hook that 3-2 would do. It's not really inspired by a lot of soulfulness. It's just kind of, you know, style that was going on. Yeah. You got different background vocalists on here, but as far as rap, the rap is mostly left for Bun B and Pimp C to shine, and that's what they do. So it's up to you to consider whether you believe that's a strength, not having a bunch of well-known features, and if you are fine with the features that were on there, or if you think that they should have had some features to make it a more classic album. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 7, the question of, does or do the weakest song or songs weigh the album down? Many will argue there are no weak songs on this album. It's always subjective, it's always up to you. If you only like the harder beats, then you may not feel the softer, the jazzy stuff, the funk-based stuff like that, and vice versa, right? There is a fair amount of singing for the hooks on this album, and I think some tracks towards the middle and end start relying a lot on that. There's only one hook on here where Bun B and Pimp C really vocalize that themselves, and that's F My Car. Ridin Dirty, you can consider that a hook. It's more in the Tupac vein of hook, where they're just repeating the phrase Ridin Dirty every bar. But for the most part, there is a fair amount of singing, and if you are not a fan of that style, that's going to be detracting. In particular, the hook on That's Why I Carry seems to go on super long. It gets repeated and repeated ad nauseum for what effect, I'm not sure, to just maybe emphasize the point of how serious the sentiment is about needing to carry a gun for fools and haters. But again, if we're coming from the idea that everything Pimp C was laying down on this album was intentional, I don't know how much this is Pimp's influence or N.O. Joe's influence, because that hook goes on longer than any hook of the day would, you know, especially if we're being radio minded, which I don't think this album was. But for the hook to go on that long, even the hardest of the hardcore fan at some point has to be like, okay, I get it. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats though. What do you think the weakest song is on here, and how much does it weigh the album down? Takes us to Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. I don't know if it's ever been explained in any deep detail why there were no videos or radio promotion for the songs on this album. So without that, this album still did fairly well and cemented the group as a fixture in Southern hip hop more than the 2 previous albums, more than any other album, because this is their highest charting album and went to number 2 on the hip hop Billboard, went gold, and you know, at this point it's probably platinum. But at the time, to not have any videos is really, really unheard of, especially on a major label like Jive. Jive was not hip hop averse. Jive had several well-known hip hop acts at that time, including Tribe Called Quest, who locked them into a legendarily horrible deal. But they had a good number of hip hop acts. So yeah, if anyone has any insight on why this album didn't get any of that, it's really unfortunate, because you could tell there were singles on here like Good Stuff, Pinky Ring, and then a lot of these other songs would have been street singles. Diamonds and Wood, Murder, even One Day You're Here, you know, that itself would have warranted a pretty cool video, or a pretty heartfelt video that would be reminiscent of I Miss My Homies, 6 Feet Deep, or Today Was a Good Day. So something is to be said about still being able to stir up that much of a following, that much word of mouth buzz, that many sales from an album without any apparent push from the label. Really, really a testament to this group's presence, to this group's love effect in the South, in Texas, and throughout the hip hop sphere. And probably some of that reciprocation, because like I said, Pimp C was shouting out people in the acting world, the sports world, the business world, as well as fellow contemporary rappers. And they also shouted out other cities, you know, big deal. They were shouting out Detroit, they were shouting out New York. Unlike a lot of rappers that do not mess with New York, they were shouting out the Bay Area. Shout out to the Bay. One of the only rappers outside of the Bay that I know who shouts out Be Legit and Vallejo. Shout out to the whole Vallejo, the feet. You know, those things don't go unnoticed. Those things get processed back. And I think that helped the push in the life of this album, but also the fact that it did stand out as a body of work with familiar and unfamiliar elements. You know, you didn't expect the level of spitting and MC type stuff that happened on this album. It was a very hip hop album, but a very Southern album at the same time, and that's not easy to pull off. In the tradition of many albums out in its time, not the most female-friendly album. If you're just listening for the musicality of it, like I said, that compelling grab you in familiar factor, anyone will probably wind up nodding their heads. I could probably get my mom to nod her head to the sound of it, but after listening to the lyrics and the way that females are talked about on this album, which is not uncommon for rap at this time, or rap in general, we're hearing, you know, women relegated to being talked about like streetwalkers, and that's, what do you expect from, you know, a rapper with whose name starts with pimp, right? But it worked, and you know, Megan Thee Stallion, she fashions herself after a lot of Pimp C influence. So we'll get to that in the next dimension. That's something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, the mass appeal. Now, dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. The impact, we keep talking about this idea of letting the music speak for itself. The South has something to say, right? Run B and Pimp C weren't angry at any other regions. They were more proud of their own region more than any other sentiment or any other emotion on this album. And it breathes through. It almost sounded like they really listen to every coast. They mention that at different points on the album. We see what the West is doing. We see what the East is doing. We're third coast. We like what both of y'all doing. This is how we get down. And there's elements of that in what they're doing. That attention to flow, pattern, detail, and intricacy of lyrics, that's not something that's traditional South. There was also a desire to get things off the chest and have meaningful things to say within verses that were reflective and therapeutic. So, you know, them being a part of this wave of Southern rappers who had already been out, but really upping the ante on proving that they are lyricists and spitters and producers that need to be respected. Also, let's talk about the fact that this became one of those word of mouth gems, and that is its own kind of impactful testament, because this is what people like to keep close to the chest as a prized possession. I was a part of that. I was up on them before you were. I was bumping this album. They weren't playing this on the radio. That becomes something that people really, really sentimentalize in their memory because of it being something that was rare or not too oversaturated, right? Now we talk about innovation. Not a lot of innovation because they stayed in a very safe zone of grabbing familiar stuff. Maybe the most innovative is the pairings, pairing the kind of spitting over these type of beats. We haven't heard them from a Southern voice yet. And so you're getting that kind of innovation of, oh, okay, here we go. Complex rhyme structures and schemes over familiar sounds. And then influence, we just talked about Megan Thee Stallion, but there's a bevy of Southern rappers who directly point to this album and what Pimp C and Bun B did separately for different reasons. So, there's a whole video floating around of T.I. referencing Bun B's verse on Murder as being his favorite verse of all time and super influential, or one of his favorite verses of all time and super influential on him as a teenager. YouTube and the social media and the internet is filled with personal testimonials of people who were touched by the song One Day You're Here, people who lived by credos that were stated by Pimp C on this album, and just the aura and dynamic and mind state that was presented on this album. But definitely the fact that you're hearing flowers and dope producers coming from Texas that were, really raising the bar for other rappers. I imagine putting on for Port Arthur, this was a big deal for that city because a lot of people within the South and damn sure outside of the South had no idea this city existed, especially in some kind of hip hop cluster. So big deal for impact, innovation, and influence. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, and takes us to the final dimension 10, the overall uniqueness and timelessness of this album. And so, uniqueness, when we keep talking about familiarities and grabbing the best of, right? You have these, organized noise influences. You got these N.O. Joe, Ghetto Boys influences. You got these kind of East Coasty, underground hip hop influences. You got these jazz influences, and you got these kind of Snoop-esque doggy style influences, right? What makes this album stand out, and you could hear those on most albums of the day, is that you're not really hearing them all in one place. This is an era of scattered and very regional sounds. And so for this album to host and house that much of a variety in one concise package of just 12 songs, which is a very safe number for classics, is a feat. And then to add on top of that they're doing this with a Southern drawl, but with lyricism, with complex rhyme structures and content. That's the package. That's what you ask for hip hop albums, and you get that. And so it escapes, wallowing in standard fare, and it escapes being lost in the sauce because it's just so unexpected. And I think, it uses the cheat code because of those familiar elements that makes these songs easy to listen to, because again, the samples were so clean. You swear you heard them before, but you never have. So One Day You're Gone, super clean. To the end, Ridin Dirty, super clean. It starts off soft and impactful, it ends soft and impactful. And in the middle, you get your up-tempo, mid-tempo, you get your aggressive, you get your dark, you get your in-between, and every box is checked off. And so if someone was to feel like this album was outdated, I wonder if it would be because of what was done over the beats, some of the hook structures, or if they really just feel like the sound is gone. But for the most part, It sounds like they tap into all the elements that create a timeless classic. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that concludes our Category 1 review of this classic album by UGK, Ridin Dirty, 1996. Check us out on the next video where we go over Category 2, the rap performance on the album. And until then, F a Rap Critic. We talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.